She stood on the dusty Wyoming platform, clutching a woven basket, her heart pounding as the towering mountain man looked at the photograph, then back at her. The silence was deafening. She braced for rejection, uttering a heartbreaking truth. His unbelievable response would echo through the valley forever. The soot-stained window of the Union Pacific train offered Mabel Montgomery no comfort as it rattled violently toward the jagged horizon of the Wyoming Territory. It was the autumn of 1885, and at 26 years old, Mabel was traveling toward a destiny built entirely on a foundation of desperate lies. Back in Omaha, Mabel had never been the kind of woman men fought over, nor even the kind they cast a lingering glance toward. She was a heavy-set woman, cursed with a soft, round figure, in an era that prized delicate, corseted waists. Her father, Josiah Montgomery, a bitter and calculating mercantile owner, made sure she never forgot her perceived inadequacies, while her younger sister Delilah was paraded through town like a porcelain prize. Mabel was hidden in the back room, tasked with heavy lifting, inventory, and keeping the kitchen fires burning. She was the family workhorse, invisible and unloved. When the letter arrived from a remote settlement in the Wind River Range, it contained a substantial sum of gold and a straightforward request. I require a wife, someone strong enough to survive the winter, loyal enough to stay, and brave enough for the frontier. Signed, Gideon Harper. Josiah's eyes had gleamed with greed at the sight of the gold, but he knew no man, not even a desperate trapper isolated in the mountains, would pay such a dowry for his eldest daughter. So, Josiah committed a cruel deception. He wrote back, accepting the proposal, but enclosed a pristine tintype photograph of the slender, beautiful Delilah. Once the final arrangements were made, he packed Mabel, a single battered trunk, hauled her to the train station under the cover of night, and issued a final threat. If she returned to Omaha, he would have her committed to the county workhouse. Now, stepping off the train into the freezing, wind-whipped dust of South Pass City, Mabel felt the full, crushing weight of her reality. The settlement was nothing more than a chaotic string of false front saloons, muddy streets, and desperate prospectors. She stood near the depot, her thick wool shawl pulled tight across her broad shoulders, a woven basket of her meager belongings clutched in her trembling hands. She spotted him immediately. He could be no one else. Gideon Harper stood like a solitary oak tree among brittle saplings. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and imposing, draped in a heavy coat of cured bear hide. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a silver scar cut a jagged path from his left temple down to his jawline, a violent souvenir from the wild country he called home. A Winchester rifle rested casually over his forearm. His piercing, ice-blue eyes scanned the few disembarking passengers before locking onto Mabel. He approached with heavy, deliberate steps. The wooden platform groaned under his boots. As he drew near, he pulled a crumpled tintype from his breast pocket, looking at the image of the delicate, wasp-waisted Delilah, and then looking down at Mabel. The mountain man's brow furrowed. The silence between them stretched, dense and suffocating. Mabel's cheeks burned with a deep, humiliating flush. Her chest tightened, and for a fleeting moment, she wished the dusty Wyoming earth would simply open up and swallow her whole. "You are not the woman in the picture," Gideon said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. It wasn't an accusation, just a blunt statement of fact. Mabel swallowed the lump of sheer terror in her throat. She had rehearsed a dozen lies on the train ride over. She had thought about blaming a mix-up at the photography studio, or claiming she had survived a terrible illness that altered her appearance. But looking up into Gideon's fierce, unwavering eyes, the lies turned to ash on her tongue. She lowered her gaze to the muddy toes of her boots, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear as the brutal truth spilled from her lips. "No one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook." She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to shout, to demand his gold back, to drag her to the station master, and put her on the next eastbound train. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable cruelty that had defined her entire life. Instead, she heard the sharp sound of tearing paper. Mabel's eyes snapped open. Gideon had ripped the tintype of Delilah cleanly in half, letting the pieces flutter out of his massive hands and into the muddy street. "I didn't order a painting to look at, Miss Montgomery," Gideon said, his expression completely unreadable. "I need a partner. The winters up on the ridge don't care how small a woman's waist is. They care if she can swing an axe, salt meat, and keep a fire burning when the snow drifts 10 feet high. You say you can cook?" I can, sir," Mabel stammered, utterly stunned. "Better than anyone in Omaha." "Then grab your trunk," Gideon commanded, turning his broad back to the station. "We have a visit to make to Judge Higgins. We're losing daylight, and I don't intend to ride up the mountain in the dark." An hour later, in the dim, whiskey-scented back room of the local assayer's office, Mabel Montgomery became Mrs. Gideon Harper. The judge rushed through the vows, barely looking up from his ledger, while Gideon stood stoic and silent at her side. When he placed a simple, heavy band of forged iron on her finger, his calloused hands were surprisingly gentle. As they loaded her trunk onto the back of his waiting buckboard wagon, Mabel felt a strange mixture of profound relief and mounting dread. She was no longer facing the wrath of her father, but she was now bound to a fierce, scarred stranger, heading into an unforgiving wilderness that swallowed weak people whole. The journey up into the Wind River Range was a brutal, bone-jarring ordeal. For 2 days, the buckboard wagon groaned over rocky inclines and through dense, shadowy forests of ancient pine. When the trail became too narrow and treacherous for the wagon, they transferred the supplies to a pair of pack mules and continued on horseback. Mabel, unaccustomed to riding, endured agonizing muscle cramps and the biting, high-altitude wind without a single word of complaint. She was determined to prove to Gideon that she was as sturdy and resilient as he required. Gideon noticed her silent endurance. He spoke little during the trek, communicating mostly in grunts or brief instructions, but occasionally Mabel caught him watching her with a quiet, assessing intensity. They reached the cabin just as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, casting the valley in deep, violet shadows. The cabin was larger than Mabel had expected, a fortress of thick, interlocking logs nestled against the side of a granite cliff. It was built for survival, not comfort. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of cold ash, dried tobacco, and old leather. The main room was vast, dominated by a massive stone hearth. To the left was a small sleeping quarter. To the right, a heavy oak door that was surprisingly secured with a thick iron padlock. "Make yourself at home," Gideon said, dropping her trunk near the hearth. "I have to see to the animals. The larder is in the cellar beneath the floorboards." Left alone, Mabel immediately went to work. This was her domain. She rolled up her sleeves, tied a faded apron around her waist, and opened the cellar trapdoor. The larder was well stocked with rough ingredients: sacks of flour, dried beans, wild onions, cured venison, and jars of preserved bear fat. She built a roaring fire in the hearth, scrubbing the heavy cast-iron skillet until it gleamed. She chopped the tough venison into small, tenderizing cubes, searing them in the bear fat with wild onions, before creating a thick, rich gravy using a handful of flour and water. She quickly kneaded a batch of sourdough biscuits, setting them in a Dutch oven near the coals to bake. When Gideon stepped back into the cabin an hour later, he stopped, dead in his tracks. The cold, sterile smell of the cabin had been entirely replaced by the mouth-watering aroma of roasted meat, savory gravy, and freshly baked bread. He hung his rifle on the wall and sat at the heavy timber table. Mabel placed a steaming tin plate in front of him, followed by a mug of hot, black coffee. Gideon took a bite of the venison. He paused, chewing slowly, his eyes widening just a fraction. He didn't say a word, but he cleared the plate in minutes, wiping up every last drop of gravy with a biscuit. "You didn't lie, Mabel," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. It was the first time he had used her name, and the deep resonance of it sent a strange warmth through her chest. "That was the finest meal I've had in 10 years. Over the next 2 weeks, Mabel transformed the rough cabin into a home. She scrubbed the floors, patched the drafty windows, and cooked meals that seemed to thaw the icy exterior of the mountain man. They fell into a quiet, respectful rhythm. Yet, a palpable tension lingered in the air, centered entirely around the locked oak door on the right side of the cabin. Every evening after dinner, Gideon would take a plate of food, unlock the heavy padlock, slip inside, and lock the door behind him. He would emerge an hour later with an empty plate, his face dark and haunted. Whenever Mabel approached the door during the day, she could hear faint, shuffling sounds from within. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was he keeping a wild animal in there? A prisoner? The isolation of the mountains began to play tricks on her mind, and the mystery of the locked door gnawed at her newfound sense of security. The truth revealed itself on a bitterly cold Tuesday afternoon. Gideon had ridden out to check his trap lines on the far ridge, leaving Mabel alone to churn butter. As she worked, she heard a loud thump from behind the locked door, followed by a sharp, muffled cry of pain. Mabel dropped the churn dasher. She hurried to the oak door, pressing her ear against the rough wood. She heard ragged, panicked breathing. "Hello?" Mabel called out softly. "Are you hurt?" There was no answer, only the sound of something dragging across the floorboards. Mabel noticed, for the first time, that in his rush to leave, before an impending snowstorm, Gideon had failed to snap the padlock shut. It hung loose on the iron hasp. Driven by a mix of fear and overwhelming maternal instinct, Mabel slid the padlock off and slowly pushed the heavy door open. The room was dimly lit, the windows boarded up to keep the cold out. Huddled in the far corner, clutching a wooden carving of a horse, was a child. It was a little boy, no older than 6, with messy raven hair, startlingly green eyes, and a face smudged with soot. He was severely underweight, and his left leg was bound in a crude, blood-spotted splint. He looked at Mabel with the wild, terrified eyes of a cornered animal. "Oh, you poor dear," Mabel breathed, sinking to her knees to make herself less imposing. "I won't hurt you." She slowly approached, holding out her empty hands. The boy shrank back, pressing himself into the logs. "His name is Leo," Mabel gasped and spun around. Gideon was standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light. He was covered in snow, his chest heaving, his face a mask of furious panic. "Gideon!" I heard him cry out. Mabel stuttered, terrified she had crossed an unforgivable line. "Who is he? Why is he locked in the dark?" Gideon stepped into the room, his anger melting into profound exhaustion. He knelt beside Mabel, reaching out to gently stroke the boy's messy hair. Leo leaned into the mountain man's massive hand, whimpering softly. "He's my nephew," Gideon said, his voice thick with sorrow. "My sister's boy. 2 months ago, a ruthless land baron down in the valley, a monster named Harrison Cole, wanted my sister's ranch for the railroad right-of-way. When she refused to sell, Cole sent his men in the dead of night. They burned the house to the ground." Mabel covered her mouth with trembling hands. "Oh, dear God. I found Leo hiding in the root cellar. He hasn't spoken a single word since that night. He broke his leg, escaping the flames." Gideon looked up at Mabel, his ice-blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't bring you up here just to cook and clean, Mabel. Cole's men are hunting the boy. As long as Leo is alive, Cole can't legally claim the deed to the land. I needed someone to protect him, to care for him when I have to go out and scout the perimeter." Before Mabel could process the immense weight of this revelation, a sound pierced the heavy silence of the cabin. It was faint at first, carried on the howling mountain wind, but Gideon recognized it instantly. He shot to his feet, his face turning an ashen gray. He grabbed his Winchester rifle off the wall and shoved a box of cartridges into Mabel's hands. "What is it?" Mabel asked, panic rising in her chest. "Hounds," Gideon whispered grimly, jacking around into the chamber. "Harrison Cole's bounty hunters. They found us." The chilling bay of the tracker hounds echoed off the granite walls of the Wind River Canyon, a sound that froze the blood in Mabel's veins. Gideon moved with the terrifying speed of a cornered grizzly. He extinguished the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into heavy shadows, illuminated only by the dying red embers of the hearth. He pushed a heavy oak table against the sturdy door and bolted the iron latches. Mabel stood paralyzed, clutching the heavy box of brass cartridges against her chest. "Keep Leo in the back room," Gideon commanded, his voice a harsh whisper that cut through the darkness. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me, Mabel?" Mabel swallowed hard, her round face pale in the moonlight slicing through the window slats. She nodded, hurrying into the dark room where the frightened child cowered. She wrapped her thick arms around Leo, pulling his small, trembling body against her own. "I have you," she whispered into his messy raven hair. "I will not let them hurt you." Outside, the crunch of heavy boots on the fresh snow shattered the mountain silence. A voice, smooth and dripping with cruel confidence, called out, "Harper, we know you have the boy in there." Gideon peered through a narrow gun port carved into the thick logs. He recognized the man standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Tom Horn, a notoriously ruthless tracker and hired gun, who had recently sold his deadly services to Harrison Cole. Horn stood tall, flanked by 6 heavily armed mercenaries, their breath pluming in the freezing night air. "You are trespassing on my claim, Horn," Gideon bellowed back, his Winchester leveled at the tracker's chest. "Take your dogs and your men back to the valley, or I will bury you right here on the ridge." Horn chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Cole holds the paper on this mountain now. Harper, hand over the orphan, and we let you live. Refuse, and we burn you out, just like we did to your sister." The mention of his murdered sister snapped the last thread of Gideon's restraint. He did not issue another warning. The heavy Winchester rifle roared, spitting a long tongue of yellow flame into the night. One of the mercenaries standing next to Horn cried out and collapsed backward into the snow. Chaos erupted. A hail of lead tore into the cabin, splintering the thick logs and shattering the clay chinking. Gideon fired rapidly, working the lever action of his rifle with brutal, mechanical precision. He dropped another man who tried to rush the porch, but there were too many. From the back room, Mabel listened to the terrifying symphony of violence. The deafening cracks of gunfire, the shattering wood, and the angry shouts of the attackers filled the cabin. She held Leo tighter, pressing her hands over his ears. But then she heard something that made her heart stop. Gideon let out a sharp, agonized groan, followed by the heavy thud of his body hitting the floorboards. "Gideon!" Mabel screamed. She released Leo, grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the cold stove, and rushed into the main room. Gideon was slumped against the wall beneath the window, clutching his left shoulder. Dark blood seeped through his thick, bear-hide coat, pooling on the floor. "I told you to stay back," he rasped, struggling to lift his rifle with his good arm. "You are bleeding to death," Mabel cried, dropping the skillet and tearing a long strip of cloth from her heavy woolen skirt. She pressed the fabric hard against his wound, ignoring his grunt of pain. "They are moving to the side window," Gideon choked out, his face pale. "They have torches. They are going to burn us out." Mabel looked toward the hearth. A large iron kettle of water, which she had hung over the fire to boil for the supper dishes, was bubbling furiously, hissing as droplets spilled into the coals. A desperate, wild idea sparked in her mind. "Keep your hand pressed on the cloth," she ordered Gideon, her voice suddenly commanding and steady. She rushed to the hearth. Using a pair of thick leather gloves, she unhooked the heavy, boiling kettle. The water inside was scalding, violent, and deadly. She hurried to the side window, just as a mercenary smashed the glass with the butt of his revolver, thrusting a blazing pine-pitch torch through the frame. With a primal yell, Mabel swung the iron kettle, hurling the gallons of boiling water directly through the shattered window into the face and chest of the attacker. The man outside unleashed a blood-curdling scream, dropping the torch and his weapon as he fell back into the snow, clawing frantically at his blistered skin. The dropped torch landed harmlessly in a deep snowbank, hissing as it extinguished. The horrifying screams of their comrade completely broke the morale of the remaining mercenaries. Even the hardened Tom Horn hesitated. Realizing the element of surprise was gone, and the defense was far more savage than anticipated, Horn called for a retreat. "Fall back," Horn shouted, his voice echoing down the mountain. "We will wait them out. They cannot run in this snow." The sound of crunching snow slowly faded as the attackers dragged their wounded down into the timberline to set up a camp. Silence, heavy and suffocating, returned to the cabin. Mabel collapsed against the wall, dropping the empty iron kettle. Her entire body shook with adrenaline and terror. She looked over at Gideon. The mountain man was staring at her, his icy blue eyes wide with absolute astonishment. "You just fought off Tom Horn and his killers with dishwater," Gideon whispered, a faint, breathless laugh escaping his lips before he slumped forward, slipping into unconsciousness from the massive blood loss. The long, agonizing night stretched on. Mabel dragged Gideon's massive frame closer to the hearth, using every ounce of her strength. She knew how to butcher game, which meant she understood anatomy well enough to know the bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, missing the vital arteries but tearing deep through the muscle. She worked tirelessly, fueled by a fierce, protective instinct she never knew she possessed. She boiled clean water, washed the jagged wound, and packed it tightly with a poultice of wild yarrow and pine sap she found in his medical supplies. She bound his shoulder tightly with clean linens, her hands steady and resolute. Through it all, little Leo crept out from the back room. The silent, traumatized child limped over on his splinted leg, sitting quietly by Gideon's head. He reached out, his small, dirt-smudged hand gently resting on his uncle's bearded cheek. The sight brought hot tears to Mabel's eyes. This shattered, hunted family needed her. For the first time in her 26 years of life, Mabel Montgomery felt truly indispensable. She was not a burden. She was their anchor. Dawn broke over the Wind River Range, casting a cold, pale light through the bullet holes in the cabin walls. Gideon finally stirred, coughing weakly. He opened his eyes, squinting against the morning glare, and found Mabel sitting beside him, a loaded shotgun resting across her lap, her eyes bloodshot, but unyielding. "You stayed," Gideon rasped, his voice rough. "I made a vow before the judge," Mabel replied simply. "And I have never broken a promise in my life, Gideon Harper. Besides, I told you I could cook. I never said I could not fight." A genuine, deeply affectionate smile broke across Gideon's rugged face, completely transforming his hardened features. He reached out with his right hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently wrapping around Mabel's soft, flour-dusted hand. "When I saw that picture of your sister," Gideon murmured, his gaze locked onto hers, "I thought I was buying a fragile ornament, a woman who would shatter in the first winter storm. But when you stepped off that train, honest and brave enough to tell the truth, I knew I had found something rare. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Mabel." Mabel's heart soared, the crushing insecurities of her past melting away under the warmth of his words. But their tender moment was interrupted by the sudden sound of heavy hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Mabel immediately raised the shotgun, placing herself firmly between Gideon and the door. "Hold your fire in there!" A loud, authoritative voice boomed from the clearing. "This is United States Marshal Frank Canton. We have Tom Horn and the rest of Harrison Cole's men in custody." Gideon forced himself into a sitting position, wincing in pain. "Canton," he muttered. "He is an honest man." Mabel slowly unbolted the shattered door and stepped onto the porch, keeping her weapon lowered but ready. A large posse of armed deputies surrounded the cabin. In the center of the clearing, Tom Horn and his surviving mercenaries sat atop their horses, their hands bound tightly with heavy hemp rope. Beside Marshal Canton was a sharp-eyed man in a fine suit, holding a leather satchel. "Mr. Harper," Marshal Canton called out, dismounting his horse. "Are you alive in there?" "Barely, Frank," Gideon shouted back through the open doorway. The man in the suit stepped forward, tipping his bowler hat to Mabel. "Ma'am, I am Agent Charles Siringo of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. We have been building a federal case against Harrison Cole for months. We tracked his hired guns up here after they burned the Valley Ranch. Cole is currently sitting in a federal cell in Cheyenne, awaiting trial for murder, arson, and land theft." A massive, overwhelming wave of relief crashed over Mabel. The nightmare was finally over. The monster who had terrorized this family, who had orphaned little Leo, was finally facing justice. "The boy is safe," Mabel said, her voice echoing clearly across the mountain clearing. "He is right here." Agent Siringo nodded respectfully. The federal court will ensure the Valley Ranch deed is legally transferred to the boy's name, securely held in trust by his uncle. Cole will never touch this family again. As the marshal and his posse led the chained mercenaries away down the mountain trail, Mabel returned inside the ruined cabin. The cold wind blew through the shattered windows, and the floorboards were stained with blood and soot. But to Mabel, it was the most beautiful home in the entire world. Gideon was leaning heavily against the hearth, his left arm bound tightly to his chest. Little Leo was standing beside him. As Mabel walked toward them, the little boy looked up at her, his bright green eyes shining with immense gratitude. He reached out, tugging gently on Mabel's stained apron. "Thank you, Aunt Mabel," Leo whispered. They were the very first words the boy had spoken in months. Mabel fell to her knees, pulling the child into a fierce, tearful embrace. Gideon slowly lowered himself to the floor beside them, wrapping his massive right arm around both his nephew and his brave, magnificent wife. Mabel buried her face in Gideon's coat, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and leather. Her father had sent her away as a worthless outcast, a cruel deception meant to secure gold. But the mountain had stripped away all the lies, leaving only the unvarnished truth. She was no longer the invisible, heavy-set girl hidden in the back room of an Omaha mercantile. She was Mabel Harper, the fierce protector of Timber Ridge, a woman who had defended her family with boiling water and unyielding courage. She had traveled to Wyoming expecting an angry, bitter rejection. Instead, in the wild, untamed heart of the Wind River Range, she had found exactly what she had always deserved. She had found a home. She had found respect. And above all, she had found a profound, enduring love that could weather any storm. What an incredible journey for Mabel. She thought her father's cruel lie would doom her, but her fierce courage and a boiling iron kettle proved that a woman's true worth is never measured by the size of her waist. She didn't just find a husband. She saved an orphaned boy and built a beautiful, lasting home. If Mabel's bravery and Gideon's unexpected tenderness captured your heart, please hit that like button. Share this thrilling frontier romance with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories.